We're thrilled that you could make it to York University on a warm and sunny day in the middle of February. My name is Carlo Fanelli. I'm an associate professor here in the Work and Labor Studies program and the interim director of the GLRC here at York. This is the 9th annual Graduate Student Symposium, Critical Conversations in Work and Labor. And we're thrilled this year that we've been able to join it with the Thomson-Eleen Lecture in Global Labor, which you'll hear about momentarily, a little bit more about momentarily. So it is the combining of these two events. But I know for a number of you, this is your first time here at the GLRC, or I shouldn't say here because unfortunately we're not in this fancy building. We're in another building that, let's say, is not as nice as this one, but it's certainly here at York. But I did want to tell you a little bit more about the GLRC because there are a number of things that we try to do here. Of course, we have a number of active research projects that faculty, students, community, and labor researchers are involved with, such as activist knowledge production, climate change and environmental justice, colonialism and decolonization, health crises and pandemics, the role of AI and platform technologies, and of course, law, rights, regulations, and governance. We also have a number of publications, some new, some previous, such as the Know Your Rights, related to, for instance, your rights at work, employment standards legislation. We have short perspective pieces, which are punchy 700 to 900 words opinion pieces that might not find a form in conventional or mainstream venues or newspapers, for instance. And in an effort to make our research as academics and wider research communities accessible to the communities and people we're writing about, we have an initiative called Research Snapshots, which are shorter, data-supported articles around 1,500 to 2,000 words, which get to the gist of the matter. As much as I'm sure everybody loves reading 10,000 genealogies, 10,000 word genealogies of the history of neoliberalism, these pieces are meant to really get to what the point of your research is. And so I would encourage all of you to take a look at that because we've launched that just this year, earlier this year. We have a number forthcoming, and I'd also really like to encourage all of you to consider submitting a piece yourselves. That being said, we are certainly in a moment where the world order is being restructured in real time before our own eyes, not only on a world historical sense, but certainly in localized and regional senses as well. The issues we'll be discussing today, both in person today and remotely tomorrow, are some of the most pressing social, political, and economic issues of our time. These are world historical transformations. Certainly in Ontario, here in Ontario, a place I've been thinking about a lot lately with regards to my own work. We've seen the addition of a million more people than 7 years earlier who don't have a family doctor. We've seen retrenchment in healthcare services to the tune where you have 50,000 fewer healthcare workers. We see Ontario Disability supports, Ontario Work, social assistance, all frozen in real terms since 2018, to the effect that they're weaker today in real terms than they were 30 years ago. Post-secondary education at the colleges and university levels are being gutted. We have 5,000 fewer frontline educational workers in primary and secondary schooling. This is just a quick snapshot of what's happening in Ontario, and unfortunately this is being replicated in local, regional, and of course national and international contexts, certainly in the context of a number of wars and ongoing impacts of colonialism and imperialism. So if that wasn't dreary enough, I do want to switch gears and thank the organizing committee because really they did all the work here. I'll just go in order of the committee here. This is made up primarily of grad students who are in a number of different programs who really took it upon themselves. So a sincere thank you from us at the GLRC for all your work on this. Ala Abdelhamid, who's a PhD student in sociology here at York. Nicole Jokinen-Hurl, who's an MA in sociology student here at York. Tino Kotara Matthews, who's a PhD student in the School of Human Resource Management. Carmen Ponce, of course, the coordinator of the Global Labor Research Center. And Julie Wilson, who's an undergraduate student in poli-sci and work in labor studies as well. So a big thank you to all of you for all your work in making this event happen. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Of course, Arun Kundnani is a writer interested in race, Islamophobia, surveillance, political violence, and radicalism. A good introduction to his overall political perspective is in his article, first published in The Guardian, There Are Two Kinds of Anti-Racism. Born in London, Kundnani moved to New York in 2010 and now lives in Philadelphia. The Guardian described him as one of Britain's best political writers. He's the author of What is Anti-Racism, published by Verso in 2023, The Muslims Are Coming, published by Verso in 2024, and The End of Tolerance, published by Pluto in 2007, which was selected as a New Statesman Book of the Year. He is also the co-author of Homeland Security, Myths and Monsters, published by Common Notions in 2024. He has written for The Nation, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and The Intercept. He's also a former editor of the journal Race and Class, and he also holds a PhD from the London Metropolitan University and is an associate of the Transnational Institute. Welcome to York, Arun. I'm sorry that the weather is not better. Maybe we can speak to the GLRC grad committee who put this conference together and ask them to switch it to the fall or spring next year. I'm sure we'd get even more interest. Big thanks are also due to Professor Abigail Bakan, who's a professor at the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and cross-appointed to the Department of Political Science. She is also an affiliate at the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. Recognized as a scholar in the fields of citizenship and anti-oppression politics, her research explores intersections of gender, race, class, political economy, and citizenship. Abigail teaches in the areas of interdisciplinary approaches to research, relationships between theory and practice/praxis, intersectionality, and global politics. So we're thrilled that Abigail accepted our invite to act as a respondent here to Arun's presentation. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Anne Thomson-Eleen, who of course is the namesake of the title sponsor for our John Alleen lecture. I'm thrilled that she is able to speak with us today, tell us a little bit more about her and John's contributions to the center, his lifelong work in labor and political movements, and we thank her for making the time today. So I will turn it over to her to speak, after which I invite Arun to come up.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlo. Yes, it is a pleasure to be with such an illustrious group this morning, being a lowly undergrad from York from 1981. But it's a pleasure to be here in person, and I know that John would be truly honored to know that a lecture to really look at the contributions that he has made to the labor movement throughout a long life. He would be truly honored for that thing. So if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to read this, okay, because slightly nervous in your company. So in 1929, John was 7 years old when the Alleen family emigrated to Canada and settled to farm in Glenella, a small town in rural Manitoba. At that time, the Great Depression, of course, was still in progress. Due to illness, the family was quarantined in Halifax for 6 weeks and had no way of communicating with friends who were already living in Glenella. Arriving by train in the early morning hours, the family spent their first night sleeping in some haystacks, and later they occupied an abandoned farmhouse before ultimately building a 2-roomed log cabin that became their first Canadian home. However, they had first to clear the land with manual effort and a horse borrowed from a neighbor. Pioneer life in the Depression was very hard and certainly required both physical and mental stamina. He attended a one-room school where he learned English quickly. He had an inquiring mind, a love of learning, reading, and classical music. And this was instilled in him early and lasted with him throughout his long life. He grew up with a desire to improve his knowledge and skills, and he did help to support his parents and his 3 siblings. In 1934, at the age of 12, John had to go to the local council and ask for relief. He was given $3, which is approximately $75 of purchasing power today, to feed the family. But his father had to work on the county roads upon his return from harvesting grain in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and working on the Trans-Canada Highway, which were the only opportunities for paid work in those days. John joined the RCAF in 1941 and became a leading flight mechanic. Now, one of the requirements was to take a flight in an aircraft that you had serviced. So this was a great incentive to do the job correctly the very first time. Although he signed up to go to the Far East, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war. After the war, he attended Winnipeg University under a Department of Veterans Affairs grant. His next stop was Toronto, and a job with the Unemployment Insurance Office. So when an opening at Canadian General Electric was posted, he applied and was hired. Soon, he was active in the Electrical Workers Union at CGE, and he joined the staff as an organizer. And believe me, he was an organizer all of his life, even of me. Through his political work, he became chair of the National Federation of Labour Youth and a member of the Labour Progressive Party until 1956. John was an excellent organizer, and he assisted many workers to organize themselves and join the UE. His proudest accomplishment was organizing the CGA plant in London, but the most memorable one was his attempt to organize the peanut vendors at the Canadian National Exhibition. Now, everything was going very smoothly until their employer provided free ice cream and false promises of more money at some point in the future. John had a varied career as a union organizer, research assistant at Sick Kids, and a fundraiser for the Canadian Cancer Society. Now, that didn't last very long because one of the board members recognized him as a union organizer, and he had tried to unionize her company. So he was dismissed about, very shortly after that. Later, he was approached by the federal government of the time to work in Ottawa, but decided he didn't want to be an eminence gris in the basement of the corridors of power. In 1964, the Ontario Federation of Labour recruited him to the position of research director, a position he held for the next 23 years until his retirement. In 1984, in the OFL's 25th anniversary publication, he explained the role of research director as follows. We don't profess to be experts in the areas that the Federation has to be concerned about, but we do have a working knowledge of the economy, taxation, energy, housing, labor relations, and employment standards, to name but a few. We have to respond when budgets are brought down, write briefs to task forces, royal commissions, and regulatory board hearings. Very busy job, and he was very industrious at it. One of John's first tasks was a major study named Poverty in the Midst of Plenty, which examined poverty in rural and urban Ontario. Later, he wrote another major study entitled Plant Shutdown, which examined the impact on the workers and their communities that had been built around that major and only employer in the area. And copies of both of those are in the GLRC library. For John, the written word was his primary tool to bring about positive change. As research director, he wrote extensively on many subjects. His belief was that 75% of what he wrote was aimed more at labour activists across the province, in the belief that it would lead to an enhanced level of political activity province-wide. Labour activists of John's generation were big picture activists. They saw the interdependence of issues. They drew on personal experiences, history, literature, philosophy, and politics, to name a few, to develop inclusive and effective strategies to address the issues facing the labour movement in Ontario. The question they would always ask one another is, what are you reading? Through his work, John became an early advocate for the labour movement to be involved in environmental issues in the workplace and the community. He represented labour in a wide variety of forums, including the Conservation Council of Ontario, and the Royal Ontario Museum, where he had two turns there. Actually, while he was there, he managed to organize the security guards while thwarting the plan to outsource their work, and they're still organized to this date, I believe. Following retirement in 1987, he was appointed research officer for a commission examining pension indexing by and I had written here Pearson government. It was actually the Peterson government. And he actually met with Jack Layton up here at York to provide some input into Jack's PhD, which I believe was on pension reform. John wrote many position papers to the government on topics such as pension reform, mandatory retirement, injunctions having no place in collective bargaining. He wrote op-ed opinions in the Toronto Star and the Globe, and an abundance of diverse articles in the Labour, Socialist, and Ukrainian heritage print media, and he continued to publish articles well into his 80s. For the last 7 years of his life, John required supplemental oxygen on a 24/7 basis, but it didn't slow him down any. For about 6.5 of those years, he attended Glendon Fitness 3 times a week, taking me with him, of course, and pulling an oxygen cylinder behind him. I had to write a letter and get his respirologist to sign it in case the Glendon staff had a fit when he arrived pulling his oxygen. Anyway, the students told him that he was really an inspiration to them to keep working out, to overcome the stress of assignment deadlines, and I'm sure we've all had some of those. If you can be committed to exercise while needing oxygen, John, then we have no excuse. So John was totally committed to labour activism, a fierce advocate for and defender of workers' rights, a passion that lasted a lifetime. He worked tirelessly for the NDP in every election until his health deteriorated. And together we walked in the Labour Day parade every year, and he felt that if the Toronto Star didn't give it enough press coverage, they heard from him loudly. So John died peacefully at home in 2015, a week after his 90th birthday. His Labour books were accepted by the York GLRC, and some of his papers went to the Ontario Archives next door. Just in finishing, I'd just like to read a brief portion of an article he wrote for a conference of the Canadian Society for Ukrainian Labour Research, entitled "Some Notable Ukrainian Canadians in the Trade Union Struggles in Ontario." Working people will always have to fight to protect their human rights and struggle for social justice and an equitable society. They will draw inspiration, courage, and a sense of community from those who have passed before them. The struggle is as valid and urgent today as ever it was. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sure it was not a 4-hour academic paper this morning. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you, Carlo and Carmen, everyone else involved in organising this lecture. Thank you to Anne for introducing us to John's life. Appreciate that. I noticed you all kind of laughed nervously when Carlo was talking about the 10,000 word genealogy of neoliberalism, which you all, I don't know if that nervous laughter was because you actually really love the 10,000 word genealogies of neoliberalism, or if they're terrifying things to you. You might get a short little bit of stuff on neoliberalism from me this morning. So you'll have to suck it up if that is a problem, I'm afraid. Okay, we are, as Carlo mentioned, we live in dark times. And, over the last year and a half, we've seen the Zionist program of mass elimination in Gaza carried out. Now the prospect of an attempt to fully remove Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, fascism is the politics of the hour. Almost everywhere, its forces are steadily breaking new ground. In the US and Europe, we're encouraged to respond to the advance of the far right by lining up behind a kind of neoliberal status quo, which proclaims its anti-fascist credentials, evoking the image of the sensible, grown-up politics of a technocrat. But as I want to show, neoliberalism has itself laid the foundations for fascism. And I don't think we can defeat fascism by uniting around the lesser evil of an establishment liberalism if the lesser evil itself creates the conditions for the greater evil. Trump's planned program of mass deportations, which I think is a project of ethnic cleansing, which could involve violently removing millions of people from the United States. Just over the last few days, we've seen that he's placing migrants in Guantanamo Bay, the prison there, which is a striking example of how his policies build on the legacy of the war on terror. Right? And that should tell us something about his project, which is that it's not simply a matter of Trumpist intolerance and hatred and irrationality, but it's about a process of making explicit what was already implicit in bipartisan policy frameworks, such as the war on terror. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that the apparent paradox here that we have to grapple with is that since the 1970s, the United States, and I think this would be true of Europe and Canada as well, has both celebrated a kind of idea of cultural diversity, culminating in the politics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, but at the same time has built these colossal infrastructures of racist violence, with the construction of border walls and surveillance, with ever greater military spending, rising police budgets, and more prisons, all justified implicitly or explicitly by presenting black, Muslim, and migrant cultures as by nature deficient. And this has been supported by Republican as well as Democrat politicians. So unfortunately, the prevailing frameworks that we have for thinking about racism and anti-racism derive from a liberal tradition that's no longer adequate to make sense of this paradox. So I want to begin by laying out what I call the liberal tradition of anti-racism, showing what it's achieved and failed to achieve, before laying out an alternative radical tradition that I believe we now need more than ever. And then I want to go on to explore how we need to understand today's structural racisms, not as is usually the case, as legacies of older histories of white supremacy, but as rooted in the very particular form that capitalism has taken since the 1970s, neoliberal capitalism, if you like. And then finally, I want to explore some of the consequences of this argument for our struggles against racism and fascism today. What I call the liberal tradition of anti-racism. Now, the liberal tradition sees racism as essentially a matter of irrational beliefs and attitudes. Its founders, such as the gay rights pioneer Magnus Hirschfeld, were interested in understanding the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. His book Rassismus, in German, translated into English in 1938 as Racism, when it was published, was the first time that the word racism had appeared in an English language scholarly text. So it's relatively recently, 1938. In the book, he analyzes the racial theories that had been developed from the Enlightenment through to the 20th century and shows how these theories were no longer scientifically credible. The problem was, he argued, that these ideas had been planted in people's minds and were now held onto irrationally, even though science had moved on. He concluded that in societies where racial prejudice were widespread, liberal democracy could be undermined by political extremists inflaming these prejudices to gain power. To remove this danger, he called on the liberal establishment to persuade the masses, especially the poor and uneducated, that racist opinions had no legitimate basis. This argument was pursued in a similar way in the United States by Ruth Benedict. At the outbreak of World War II, she decided to write a book of popular science that she hoped would serve as what she called a handbook for tolerance education in schools, churches, and clubs throughout the US. Published in 1940 with the title Race, Science, and Politics, the book stressed cultural relativism as a way of countering the racist idea of an evolutionary hierarchy of cultures from primitive to civilized. Achievements in art and invention were evenly distributed across cultures, Benedict argued. What motivated these initiatives of the late 1930s, early 1940s, was the sense that racism threatened liberal government and could, as had happened in Germany, completely overwhelm it. This fear led normally cloistered biologists, anthropologists, and social psychologists to become the public faces of a new anti-racism, mobilizing the authority of their academic credentials to counter the scientific pretensions of racists. Irrational dogma was the problem, and anti-racist expertise the solution. Above all, liberal anti-racists clung to the belief that racist attitudes could be gradually diminished and then eliminated by well-meaning elites cultivating attitudes of rationality, tolerance, and the celebration of diversity, as Hirschfeld and Benedict had proposed. On this view, political and cultural elites had a heroic role to play in challenging racist prejudices and thereby saving liberal democracy from the threat of extremism. The subsequent history of liberal anti-racism is the history of the various techniques deployed to carry out this moralistic top-down program of unmasking false ideas and rooting out improper attitudes. This approach remains at the core of liberal anti-racism today, from the enthusiasm for diversity training, which is now a $4.3 billion business in the United States, to the hope that better representation in Hollywood films would educate us out of our biases. The difference now is that liberals seek to eliminate racist attitudes in the unconscious as much as the conscious mind. Now, at the same time that this liberal anti-racism was forming in Europe and the United States in the 1930s and 40s, a radically different way of thinking about racism was taking shape in the places that Europe had colonized. The Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James, for example, in a 1938 article on racism in Africa, argued that British colonial racism was not a set of beliefs or attitudes, but a structure of generally observed social rules and policies that enabled economic exploitation. Individual racist attitudes no doubt existed, but were not the decisive factor. This radical tradition thus sees racism as a matter of how economic resources are distributed differently across racial groups. By 1956, the Martinican psychiatrist Frantz Fanon was arguing that we should, quote, abandon the habit of regarding racism as a disposition of the mind, a psychological flaw. Rather, he says, military and economic oppression most frequently precedes, makes possible, and legitimates racist beliefs. And this, what he called systematic oppression of a people, can continue even if a majority of citizens do not have racist biases, unconsciously held or otherwise. From the radical anti-racists derives our contemporary idea of structural racism. Of course, they understood that racism could be seen in individual attitudes, prejudices, and dogmas of some members of the societies they were writing about. But more significant to them were the ways that land, labour, and rights were socially and politically organised through racist structures that had a coherence and necessity that was independent of the individual attitudes that might exist in that society. Now, according to mainstream neoclassical economics, the distribution of resources in a society is about supply and demand curves that are in principle racially neutral. And from that starting assumption, it's possible to show that individual participants in a market are disincentivized from acting on racial prejudices. Okay. So that would imply capitalism is ultimately anti-racist. Right? The non-racist producer is likely to find more consumers and better workers, right, than the racist producer. And the same is true of consumers, according to the neoclassical way of thinking. Orthodox Western Marxism sometimes seems to share that assumption that capitalism is ultimately anti-racist. Think of that line from the Communist Manifesto of capitalism throwing out venerable and ancient prejudices, right? Again, with the view, if you have this assumption that racism is defined as a mental disposition. Now, from both those places, the debate that we then have today becomes, is the Trump voter irrationally placing prejudice over their rational economic interest. Right? That recurring debate that we keep having. But radical anti-racism rejects that framework. In that model, racism refers to broad social structures that pattern the unequal distributions of resources, either within a country or between countries. Race provides a means by which capitalism can more intensively exploit certain categories of worker, the enslaved, the indentured, colonized peasantries, migrant workers, as well as justify discarding peoples who are deemed superfluous to the economy. Making the distinction between liberal and radical transforms the debate on anti-racism. Conservative attacks on the elitism of anti-racists ring true to many because liberal anti-racists do indeed think it is the job of elites to educate working class people out of their irrational beliefs. But that's less true of radical anti-racists, who might despair at the historical reluctance of white workers to unite with other exploited classes, but they're clear that wealthy elites are their main antagonists. To them, anti-racism is about finding ways to build collective power across differently positioned groups of working people. Now, liberal anti-racists have succeeded over the last half century in reducing racial prejudices in interpersonal relationships and have transformed the representation of people of colour in popular culture. But advances in reducing prejudice and improving representation have not lessened the racism that exists in law, policy, and broader economic and institutional practices. And those have mushroomed at the same time that the prejudices at the individual level have been reduced. And that's because liberal anti-racism misunderstands the causes of structural racism. The neoliberal political and economic project since the 1970s has led inexorably to both liberal anti-racism becoming a kind of dominant ideology and new forms of structural racism at the same time. On the one hand, neoliberal market universalism implies a celebration of cultural diversity, right? Every culture should be free to have its place in the market. And at the same time, a rejection of racial discrimination at the individual level. On the other hand, whether or not neoliberals admitted it, their commitment to market mechanisms to block any redistributions of wealth set them against the interests of black and third world movements. And neoliberalism generated large populations of people uprooted from pre-existing livelihoods, but unable to be absorbed into neoliberal labour markets. For these populations deemed surplus to the market order, neoliberalism had to be imposed by force. Thus, the neoliberal order could only be maintained through a colossal expansion of border military policing and carceral violence. The disposables of the world were subjected to slaughter on an industrial scale in border violence and in global wars of counterinsurgency presented as wars on terror and drugs, with an estimated 3.6 million indirect deaths in the post-9/11 war zones of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Within the United States and Europe, police violence has been directed most often at disproportionately black abandoned populations. For most people in the world, neoliberal markets have not been liberating but disciplining, and that discipline has had to be imposed through unprecedented levels of coercive violence, organised and justified through race. The same neoliberal think tanks who argued for the principles of market freedom also successfully advocated for building a vast racially coded infrastructure of border military policing and carceral violence. The more that the market order failed to find universal consent and had to be imposed by force on unwilling populations, the more neoliberals relied on racist ideas of culture to manage their anxieties, organise their proposals, and legitimate their aggressions. The genocidal war that Israel is waging in Palestine is another example, because settler colonialism also renders natives as surplus populations. Now, these infrastructures of racist policing, military border, and carceral violence act as charging stations for fascist movements, a constant source of political energy they can absorb. Thus, the War on Terror seeded a new crop of fascist movements in Europe, claiming to oppose Islamization, cultivated US support for Netanyahu, and supplied the building blocks for Trump's first presidential campaign. The War on Terror held that the United States needed to surveil, track, and violently dominate a nebulous global enemy called radical Islam. But facing defeat in Iraq and Afghanistan, many in the US began to question the War on Terror's global footprint, while accepting the idea that Muslims should be suspected of extremism by virtue of their religious identity. The real war, they argued, was at home, and the enemies were the liberal elites and the Muslim immigrants supposedly welcomed by globalist politicians. This was the entry point for Donald Trump to find a political base. His path to the White House began in 2011 when he promoted the false theory that Barack Obama is a Muslim born in Kenya. After it, he announced his Muslim ban policy in late 2015, Trump's campaign soared. Just over 4 years later, on January the 6th, 2021, the Trump movement attempted a regime change at the seat of power responsible for so many regime changes elsewhere in the world, Washington, D.C. It was indeed a remarkable example of Aimé Césaire's boomerang effect, dictum that imperialist violence afflicted abroad always returns to corrupt the homeland. Trump was indeed, to a large extent, the war on terror coming home. Now, to understand the broad process that's played out since the 1970s, we need to examine once again the neoliberal turn of that decade. Neoliberalism was a response, as much a response to decolonization in the Third World and black struggle in the United States as a response to the white left in the West. In the early 1970s, the United Nations recognized the right of Third World countries to nationalize foreign-owned assets and was talking about reparations for European colonialism. These calls for the redistribution of wealth from the West to the Third World were deeply troubling to neoliberal thinkers. Organized labor in the West and Third World national liberation movements were considered equivalent and related threats. As a leading neoliberal thinker, Lionel Robbins, put it, "The mines for the miners and Papua for the Papuans are analytically similar slogans." Neoliberals thought that European colonialism had set limits to demands for social justice. Now that those boundaries were breaking down, the question was how to build a new world in which demands for redistribution of wealth could be constrained in some new way appropriate for the end of European formal empire. The answer that neoliberal intellectuals came up with was to focus upon the cultural conditions necessary to get people to follow the impositions of market discipline without having to be continuously coerced to do so. They understood that so-called free markets depended on whether people were willing to pursue their desires through market mechanisms and accept the distribution of resources that markets generated. That willingness or lack of it was a matter of cultural values. And neoliberal intellectuals were deeply anxious about whether those cultural values extended outside of the West. Hayek, for example, thought the market order is inseparable from what he called the common cultural tradition that undergirds it. Free markets, he thought, require a tacit propensity among a people to obey certain general rules of conduct upon which the market depends. This cultural foundation is a matter of what he called the whole cultural inheritance, which is passed on by learning and imitation. And for him, this inheritance is Western civilization. It followed that failing to uphold Western cultural values would endanger the market system. When newly independent Third World nations demanded changes to the international economic system, neoliberals interpreted this as evidence of a cultural deficiency. Third World peoples were not culturally suited to Western market systems. In this way, what was essentially a political problem, who gets to set the rules for the international economic system, was transposed into a cultural problem. Do they have the right values to follow the rules of the system? With the problem reframed, the challenge was how to deal with this cultural deficiency. And the answer that came from all the leading neoliberal thinkers was that this cultural deficiency is fixed and therefore force is necessary if a neoliberal world order is to prevail. Thus, the world the neoliberals wished to create could only be brought into existence and maintained through large-scale violence. And within the terms of their philosophy, this violence could only be justified by presenting third world cultures as by nature deficient. As neoliberal think tanks, politicians and intellectuals gained political influence, they worked with Western governments to reconfigure new global and domestic racial boundaries to replace the older ones that had been weakened by decolonization and the Black freedom movement. They conjured a racial vocabulary: welfare queens, Muslim extremists, illegals, narcos, super predators, etc., to provide a language with which to code and organize this neoliberal response. Racism today is not, as commonly conceived, a hangover of the past. It's an infrastructure of oppression that's been generated quite specifically over the last half century by neoliberalism's reconfiguring of older structures of racism. It's not simply that racism has become more subtle or unconscious after its overt forms have been defeated. It's more that there was no longer a need to routinely make explicit assertions of racial superiority. Racial inequalities are reproduced through neoliberalism's market systems alongside newly intensifying infrastructures of government violence, carried out in the name of seemingly race-neutral concerns about crime, migration, and terrorism. Liberal notions of diversity and inclusion are completely compatible with these forms of racist structural violence. White liberals can heroically confront their own unconscious biases all they want, yet these structures will remain. Take, for example, the border infrastructure that has vastly expanded globally since the 1970s. Elements of the left believe, I think based on a narrow understanding of political economy, that there is a capitalist interest in open borders. On this view, bringing in labour from outside the West enables lower wages and increases profits. Now, a desire for cheap labour, of course, exists, but it's met as much through fostering heavily policed, undocumented workforces, which in fact require strong, not open borders. A more important aspect of the political economy of borders is the need to maintain a wage difference between the imperialist core and the periphery. Take, for example, the border cutting through the middle of the Juarez-El Paso conurbation between the United States and Mexico. It allows capital and goods to move freely, but not labour, making it possible for the cost of employing a manufacturing worker on the Mexican side to be 1/5 of what it is on the US side. This, of course, is about immediate profits for the US corporations which outsource production to the maquiladoras in Mexico. But there's another level at which capitalists act on the border. They also want to secure the overall rule of their class over the social order. Here, the consideration, and this is where the think tank networks come in, is about the cultural makeup of the peoples allowed to form the working classes of the core capitalist countries. Some capitalists believe there are advantages to a multicultural core, but a larger number fear that immigration to the core countries of working peoples who, because of their origins, are seen as culturally antagonistic to market rationality, will weaken perceived individualist and entrepreneurial Western values, and therefore reduce the power of the capitalist class. The infrastructure of border violence, with its vast death toll in the deserts and seas to the south of the United States and Europe, is the result of all of this. It's an institution of racial segregation because capitalists want it to be. This is why the term racial capitalism is an appropriate description of the social order we're subject to. That does not imply that white people are exempt from the violence of prisons and policing and so on, or that other structures such as gender oppression are absent from this order. Nor does it mean that capitalism cannot exist without racism. What is impossible is a capitalism that does not involve some system of ascribed difference to organize and legitimize its different forms of exploitation and extraction. What does this mean? It means that to be anti-racist today means working collectively with organizations to dismantle racist border, policing, carceral, and military infrastructures. It means understanding that the poor of the global south are as equally entitled to the world's resources as the wealthy residents of the north. It means opposing Zionism. In the end, it requires us to build an economy of care, not killing, uplifting all working classes of whatever colour. And in fighting for that, we're going to have to confront not just external forces, but also what lies within ourselves. Capitalism keeps pushing us to be competitive, to trample over each other to get a few more crumbs. It breaks our hearts every day. It hardens us. It makes us less human. We're all carrying the pains that result from living in racial capitalism, which exploits all working people in racially differentiated ways. And neoliberalism encourages us to individualize our pain and to think that the solution to our pain is for the world to recognize the very specific and unique pain that I'm experiencing as an individual. So the pain becomes the definition of me. And social media, of course, trades on sharing pain. And so we're invited to compete with everyone else over whose pain deserves the most attention. Now, we're never going to build the collective power we need to dismantle the structures that harm us all by turning inward and attending to the uniqueness of our individual pain. As James Baldwin wrote, you must understand that your pain is trivial, except insofar as you can use it to connect with other people's pain. And insofar as you can do that with your pain, you can be released from it. So many of our organizations fall apart because everyone's trying to say, well, my pain needs to be prioritized over your pain. My identity needs to be prioritized over your identity. Identity is nowadays understood as a highly personalized sense of self, a kind of deep and unique truth about us that's often taken to imply that it's metaphysically impossible for you to ever be able to have solidarity with me. The question is then no longer, how do we build the kinds of organizations that we need to fight the system? It's more, let me tell you why you can never understand my identity. Stay in your lane. This is my lane. This is me. This is my identity. And I can only ever possibly unite with other people who share the same identity as me. This is the prevailing argument. Well, that means we can't build anything. Once you accept this idea of identity on those terms, there's no stabilizing point at which you can say, okay, now these are my people, and that's somehow fixed. The idea of my people is always something that's built through struggle. It's not something that's given by identity itself. So as soon as you accept the logic of identity, ultimately you're on your own. You have no solidarity with anyone. It becomes a culture of, look at my pain, look at my identity, and that's the perfect situation for neoliberalism, because neoliberalism can almost be defined as a project to make solidarity impossible. It organizes us to think that we're in competition with others for resources, including in a mediated society, the resource of attention. It invites you to consume products to give you pride in your identity. Here are the Hollywood movies that show a positive representation of your identity. Here are all the other cultural products that make you feel better about your identity. Now, do you feel better about your identity? Maybe you do, right? I'm not saying you don't. But the oppression is still there. And the only way you're going to change that oppression is if you change how you think about your relationship to the struggle that can overcome it. Because it can't be done through these narrow conceptions of identity. Identity is not a truth inside you waiting to be discovered. It's a creation, not a discovery. It's what you create with others. You are what you do with others. Even in these darkest of times, I find faith in what I know to be true of human beings. But to only pursue competition and domination is unrewarding. They do not satisfy the soul in the way that genuine human connection does. And socialism is nothing if it's not the organization of society to reflect our human need for being together. Thank you.
Hello, well, I have the tough act to follow. I want to just make a few comments, and let me just start by acknowledging a few things about who we are, where we are right now. We're speaking, of course, on Indigenous land, which is stolen, and I just want to acknowledge the ongoing colonial character of the Canadian state, and we hope to be good guests on this land. I also want to thank the Global Labor Research Center for having organized this panel and for inviting me. I want to thank Carlo Fanelli, who answered a gazillion of my curious emails, Prior to that, I was invited by Adrian Smith because this conference was planned last year, but of course it was disappointing to be postponed, but I was thrilled that it was postponed in solidarity with the CUPE strike that was happening at the time, and it's good for us to have the flexibility to regroup. So the comments that I want to make are sort of in three parts. First, I want to highlight and consider some of the contributions that Arun Kundnani has made in this important book, What is Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism. Then I want to consider a few roving examples from the Canadian context that indicate the striking relevance and urgency of the analysis. And third, I just want to share some thoughts about addressing received orthodoxies that I think are provoked by this text. So for those of us who are involved in what we hope to be engaged scholar activism or activist scholarship, of course we commonly refer to racism as something that we challenge and oppose, and anti-racism as the way to do this. Sorry, I'm like many people overcoming a cold. I absolutely tested negative. Anyway, rarely do we see in-depth analysis or theoretical considerations of exactly what these words mean and what do we do with them until now. So thank you for this text. So Arun has helped us to not only name racism, but to trace how the same word, the same concept in some ways has very different meanings, and we have to do our homework. We have to do our work to understand the detail about that. And this helps us to navigate and to challenge the limitations of liberal approaches. And it also helps us to reflect on some shallow and painfully weak efforts to oppose racism, even within the radical canon, the Marxist canon, the white left, or various ways of referring to it. But while there is a rich tradition of anti-racist theory, and Arun has helped us to understand some actors and to highlight some other actors that we knew about this, there has also been a kind of embrace of certain liberal attitudes about racism in some of the more radical traditions. And that's complicated. And for those of us, I'm an alumni from this university. I mean, York University has prided itself as actually being a center for radical education, and some of our dear mentors are also subject to some critique. So we can be grateful here for Arun's deep engagement in this text with concepts of capitalism and notions that are forwarded about capitalism that see racism as ephemeral, not constitutive, pre-capitalist, feudal. There are a lot of ways in which this is identified and understood as kind of, there's a main contradiction, there's a lot of different language depending on the thread and the strand of radical tradition that you come from, but the notion is that we eventually get to capital and labor. And we get to capital and labor as abstract categories which are not encumbered by these complexities of oppression and racialization. That includes, of course, allowing us to think about other forms of oppressions, gender oppressions, LGBTQ oppressions, and so on and so forth. But that notion of what capitalism is has real implications in terms of theory, but also in terms of practice. And these views have proven to be empirically and methodologically ill-informed. And they fail to explain, importantly, and Arun addressed this in his comments, the current period where racism and racial divides are increasing. And not just increasing because they're a legacy of the past, but increasing because they're necessary to the reproduction of the system as it currently exists. So we're introduced to new actors. Antoine Decombe is a name that I didn't know before. We revisit others like Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, C.L.R. James in important ways. And we have a sort of new way of imagining some of these discussions about racism and anti-racism in this lexicon. So I want to say I really like this book, and I really hope everybody here has an opportunity to read it. I think we should take it into our research, into our classrooms, into our social movements, and think deeply and seriously about the implications of it. So it's a provocative text. It doesn't do everything. No text should. Any of us who have written texts are always knowing we have to decide what not to put in it. We advise our graduate students, you can't do everything, and it shouldn't. But one of the things about the text is it's grounded in a number of examples in the US, the UK, and Europe, and the Global South. But there, of course, are many other places where racial capitalism operates, and Canada here is one of them. So we're now about to embark on a federal election. In Ontario, we're currently in an election. The scope is limited at electoral politics, but if we look wider at some of the social movements and some of the debates that are generated, some of them are interesting. In 2024, the Liberal government of Canada introduced its second edition of a comprehensive anti-racism strategy called Changing Systems, Transforming Lives, Canada's Anti-Racism Strategy 24 to 28. This was a revisiting of the first edition in 2019, and the fact that Canada has an anti-racism strategy is the product of decades of struggle. This is not something the Liberals thought up as an election strategy. It was the product of mass movements over decades advocating, and there's some things in there where the language is positive. But it also does a number of tricky things. One of the things that it does is it offers a definition of anti-Semitism. And here we can consider the term anti-Semitism, I'm using it to mean anti-Jewish racism. But to do this, not unsurprisingly, it adopts the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which is notably vague, but includes a series of examples. 7 of the 11 examples that are listed are in reference to the State of Israel, and including an explicit identity that any criticism of Israel as a racist endeavor is a sign of anti-Semitism. So some of us through our activism have, of course, been dealing with this, but in practice what has happened is wherever the IHRA working definition has been adopted, it's been weaponized to use the term anti-Semitism to silence Palestinian voices, to silence Palestinian rights claims, and to silence solidarity action around Palestine, and it is intended to do that. So clearly this indicates the absolute limits of a classically liberal approach to anti-racism, which is identified explicitly in this text. But in challenging this policy, we also have to take responsibility that we clearly need to see the connections not only to racism, but also to anti-racism in the liberal democratic state. And the global relations that include the relationship of Canada to the United States, to the State of Israel, to the population that are seen as Muslim, Palestinian domestically in the diaspora, and to obliterate any discussion of the genocidal actions that Israel is taking currently as we speak against the Palestinians. So Arun invites us to recall Fanon's consideration of the need for stretching even the most sedimented categories, including Marxist categories and historic assumptions, to ensure we seriously address the impact of colonialism, imperialism, structural racism, and neoliberalism. So let me just conclude by thinking a little bit about this stretching. How far are we prepared to go? Because this isn't just an intellectual question, it's an emotional question. It's a question of how far do we criticize our peers? How much do we revisit things that we were so confident about for so many years, that we've written and we've published about? How far are we prepared to go? And I'm asking that as a genuine question, and I've asked it of myself. I recently had the opportunity to write an article with my colleague and co-author Yasmin Abulabin for a special issue of Marxism and Anti-Semitism in the journal Historical Materialism. The original article was drafted before October 7th. The final article was published after October 7th. But in writing this, we were compelled to visit and revisit a number of questions, including what brought us and me in particular, because I have had a deeper love affair with Marx than my colleague Yasmin Abulabin has. I sometimes describe myself as having had a history of monogamy with Karl Marx, and I'm now saying we have to see other people. But anyway, there are so many incredibly cringeworthy comments in Marx's writing about anti-Semitism that my eyes have gone over and sort of given it a pass. And there's something really wrong about that epistemically. This is not only about what Marx wrote in reference to his early works on the Jewish question, but also in writings that are included largely in footnotes, but they're in the text of Capital. Even some of Marx's ardent defenders, like Kevin Anderson, have been compelled to say, on this issue, Marx is not an inspirational model. So Marx explicitly followed the widespread and anti-Semitic stereotyping, imagining Jews as inherently committed to usury, cheating, and corruption in moneyed life. And he used it as an example of the ultimate capitalist. So on the Jewish question, for instance, Marx, I'm quoting him, says, what is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is the worldly God? Money. So it's not just a question of dealing with the cringeworthiness, but Marx's definition of capital actually embedded this anti-Semitic concept. It's like, this is kind of like exploding, you know, in terms of, well, what else does that mean? Commonly, we say that Marx was a pioneer well ahead of his time on so many ideas. He was iconoclastic. He was the, you know, the critic of capitalism while capitalism was still in its birth pangs. But yet we give him a pass on the questions of anti-Semitism. He also used the N-word in German. He also relied on who's seen as the founder of racist anthropology, Henry Louis Morgan. We have some issues here. So my point is that perhaps the contradictory legacy of Marxism that we see is at least in part arguably reflective of some contradictory work in Marx's own work. And are we prepared to stretch that far? I mean, I'm sort of sharing with you a moment that I'm in where I haven't really come to terms with this. But Marx is an inconsistent thinker. He absolutely was a campaigner against plantation slavery. He absolutely opposed exploitation and alienation. His work on oppression, You know, if you read him queerly and turn your eyes and squint, you can see the beginning of a Marxist theory of oppression. And Himani Banerjee, a retired faculty member from this university and a mentor of many of us, says the thing is we can use Marx as categories against Marx. We can't do that with liberalism. And I think that is kind of an invitation. And I would argue this seems to me to be consistent with Arun's consideration in the text that we're looking at today of debates in the Marxist movement, mentioning, for example, the Eurocentric nature of the Communist Manifesto, addressing explicitly how the French Communist Party opposed Algerian independence, and dealing head-on with the debates around M.N. Roy. So thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for this provocation. And why is all of this important? I'll end with a quote from Arun Kundnani in What is Racism and Why It Means Anticapitalism. Only after we understand how racism's systemic nature operates will we be able to imagine the kinds of collective action that would dissemble it. Without such an understanding, anti-racism is more an exercise in personal development for white people than genuine structural change. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Anne, Arun, of course, and Abby for excellent presentations. We have about 15 minutes or so for some discussion. I couldn't help but be reminded during your presentation, Abby, of Engels' old saying and Marx's old saying, you know, if I know anything, I'm certainly not a Marxist. And one of the things that I think distinguishes Marxism, as Engels was known to say, was that Marxism is, before anything else, certainly not an ideology, it's a method of analysis, right? And I think turning Marx on himself is a great way of thinking about that. So thank you for that, of course, Aaron, as well. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions. Perhaps we can take a couple at a time and give our authors, our speakers, a moment to reply, and we can go from there. Maybe I can abuse my role as chair for a moment and throw an additional question in there, and I think it builds on what both of our previous guests have asked with regards to their questions. As of late, I've been really, and I think both of your presentations really got me thinking more about this. I'm really interested in this epiphenomenon of working class conservatism thriving in places that are not seen as the natural homes of conservatism. We tend to think about it as predominantly white, rural, perhaps even suburban areas. But certainly in Ontario here, our conservative premier's strongest bases of support are also amongst the predominantly lowest paid workers, which tend to be amongst the most heterogeneous certainly across race, ethnicity, language, and also religion. And this is in many ways akin to some phenomenons in the United States among blue states flipping red, right? And so I'm wondering how this complicates many of the issues. And of course, there's no answer here, but I'd be just interested in some general thoughts anyone might have on this question. So we've certainly given our speakers some food for thought. I'll turn it over to Arun to start us off.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Abby, especially, and the questions. Yeah, on your question about this, I mean, this is the classic question, right? Of how do we think about the relationship between class struggle and anti-racist struggle, really, right? And I think so. It's a big thing to get into, but let me say briefly. It's not. So for me, it's not a matter of balancing race versus class, and nor is it a matter of will the abolition of capitalism end racism as well. I don't think we can abolish capitalism using the methods that Western Orthodox Marxism proposes, precisely because their idea of class is one that, in fact, as Abby kind of summarized very clearly, it's an idea of class that abstracts class from the actual ways that class is embedded in racial capitalism, right, and is racialized, right? We don't have a direct access to some notion of class purity outside of questions of race, questions of gender, questions of sexuality, right? So I want there to be working class unity, right? Like, I think that's a great thing to aim towards. We're not going to get it by saying, let's set aside questions of race to one side and imagine that we're all working class and black and white and unite and fight. We're not going to get it like that, right? And part of the reason we're not going to get it like that is because if you accept so the point is that race is not just something at the level of ideology, it's also a material difference, right? It's a material difference. In other words, capitalism works by organizing through race in such a way that different categories of laboring populations have materially different relationships to capitalism, right? And race organizes that. So the classic example would be plantation slavery, right? The material relationship between capitalism and an enslaved person is fundamentally different from the material relationship between capitalism and a so-called free worker, right? Like, one is owned by as capital and the other is exploited by capital. It's a different relationship, right? So, and race organizes that difference, because race enables you to say, we can get over the apparent contradiction of capitalism claiming that it's a form of economic activity in which freely contracting individuals, one who has capital and one who has labor, come together and freely exchange, right? So how do we explain capitalism having plantation slavery at the core of it in the early 19th century, right? Well, we use race to explain that away. Of course, the normal rules of individual freedom don't apply because these people are not white, right? Same thing in principle with migrant workers, right? How come we have a completely separate system of state policing of migrant workers from the rest of the working class in a country like Canada? Because implicitly or explicitly, race becomes the argument, right? So, materially different relationships to capital. Therefore, no guarantee that those different categories of labouring populations are necessarily always going to have exactly the same shared interest in the short term. In the long term, yes, they all have a shared interest in getting rid of this system, capitalism. In the short term, there's going to be situations in which it makes sense for racialized workers to say, actually, there's no point us banging our heads against this white wall of prejudice that stops us from having a unified response with other workers who happen to be white, because they don't see us as part of the same struggle. They don't see our struggle reflected in their own struggle. So we're never going to be able to unite with them in the short term. We need to have our own autonomous struggle as black people, or as whatever racialized category in whatever particular context. It's going to be very context dependent. In other situations, absolutely there's going to be a possibility of unity there, right? In other situations, there's going to be a possibility of coordinated struggle, even if it's not a unified struggle, right? Like if you read C.L.R. James in Black Jacobins, there's a beautiful moment that he describes when, even though there's very little communication between the revolutionary movement in what becomes Haiti, right? The enslaved people overthrowing the slave plantations there, they're not really in communication with revolutionary workers in Paris, but because both of them, because the way that the bourgeoisie of Paris profits from enslavement in the Caribbean, those two struggles are actually aligned and coordinated, right? Even though it takes months for them to write letters between them, even if they are doing that, who knows, right? So those are always possibilities, but it's not. There's no guarantee. You know, Stuart Hall used to talk about a Marxism without guarantees. This is what he meant. There's no guarantee that if we just strip aside all these people call cultural considerations, right? The race, the gender, all these other forms. If we just strip that away, underneath we'll find the purity of our class unity, right? There's no guarantee that we'll find it there, right? So that's how I think of that. Question about labour organising in terms, and then how that relates to anti-Muslim racism, war on terror. I think when we think about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, we have to be very specific about the context that we're talking about. It's like all forms of racism, there's no general formula, right? It's very context dependent. And so if you think about a situation like the United States, you know, what drives the war on terror and anti-Muslim racism in the United States is centrally the United States' imperialist relationship to the Middle East, right? That's been the central thing, and it's something that in the book I trace really. I'm not one of these people who thinks that there is this kind of ancient, permanent antagonism between the West and Islam going back to the Crusades or anything like that. I think that's not really the history. I think the particular form that we have anti-Muslim racism in a country like the United States over the last couple of decades has its origins in the early 1970s, actually, right? So we can actually see certainly in my lifetime the emergence of a new form of racialization. Right? It should be an opportunity for us to really use that to help us theorize what racialization is and what it looks like, right? Because it's something that we can actually live through and see in our very recent history, unlike, say, anti-black racism, which obviously has a much longer history, right? So you can trace how it's generated out of the US foreign policy establishment trying to plot its agenda in the Middle East, right? Anti-Muslim racism in the United States comes out of that. In Europe, it's a different story, right? In Europe, the context is one in which there is in most European countries, the most marginalized sections of the working classes in those countries are disproportionately Muslim, right? Precisely because people who happen to be Muslim or from Muslim majority countries, let's say, were brought in to be that part of the labor force, right? The lower rung of the labor force. Whether you're thinking about, France, where it's people from North Africa, Germany, where it's people from Turkey, Holland, where it's people from Morocco and Turkey, Britain, where it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., right? So, and of course, just by even giving that list, you already have a sense that part of this is bound up with longer histories of European colonialism, right, in Africa and Asia and so on. So in Europe, the question of class and Islamophobia comes in much more immediately than it does in the United States, right? So, I think much of what what I argue in the book about the relationship between race and capitalism plays out in Europe around the question of Islam, right? Where Muslimness becomes a racial signifier that plays these kind of roles of a way of separating out part of the working class, the better to exploit the working class as a whole. Right? In the United States, it's not doing that for Muslims within the United States itself, but it's playing a role in terms of imperialism, which is a different dynamic. Okay? The question of working class conservatism. I think this is something that I can't speak to the Canadian context with much knowledge of it. I can speak to the context in the United States and Britain, where I would say, so first thing to say is conservatism among working classes in Britain and the United States is a long-standing phenomenon, right? It's like hidden historically because we tend to tell a story of the power of organized labor through the 20th century when we think about working class politics. But if you look at, say in Britain, if you look at the history of who votes for the Conservative Party in Britain, it's always had, so long as working class people have voted, it's had a strong working class base of support, right? And it's worked hard to get that through mobilizing notions of race and nation, right? And if you study the history of, the key thinkers in the history of conservatism in a country like Britain, they are very well aware that this is how they have to secure hegemony for their political project, is by mobilizing race and nation in order to win a section of the working class to what they understand is a political agenda that is opposed to the organized interests of the working class, right? So they understand what they're doing there. The more recent development that I think is something that is entirely new in a country like Britain or the United States is the support for conservative politics, the level of support for conservative politics amongst South Asian people, African American people, black people in Britain, and so on and so forth, right? And there are, I think explaining that is it's necessary to focus both on why centrist politics or left politics have failed those constituencies, right? And the answers to why that has happened, I think, come out of what we've already said this morning. But then also, what are the ways that conservative movements are being innovative, let's say, creative, let's say, in finding new kinds of multiracial constituencies, right? Which they understand they need to do if they're going to succeed in elections in a country like Britain or the United States in 2025. And again, this is something that is context specific. But in the case of Britain, you would certainly want to identify the very strategic moves that the Conservative Party has made in building alliances with Hindu nationalism, for example, right? And in the United States, the alliance between the Trump movement and Hindu nationalism in the United States is there as well. So we unfortunately live in a world where every ethnicity has developed its own form of conservative politics, right? So the potential for alliances across different ethnicities, ethnicities which have historically had deep-seated antagonisms towards each other, nevertheless can find common ground through a shared agenda around a conservative politics, right? And I don't think there's any. Again, there is. We're talking about the need for a Marxism without guarantees. There's no guarantee that people who are racially oppressed turn against the system that oppresses them and find some natural pathway to radical politics, right? just as there's no natural guarantee that all workers are going to unite around a class politics. Okay, these are things that need to be built, not assumed. Thank you.
I'll just speak very briefly because I really feel like you're the main act and I'm the pre-show and I'm coming in the post-show. So I just want to add a couple of points to these really important questions. The question of collective action and Marxism, I mean, Arun has addressed, but I will just add that I think there's a legacy of a concept of stages about radical politics, that we can't do everything at once, so we have to do it in stages. And the concept of stages has been theorized specifically in terms of modes of production and transformation, but it also takes a form in terms of like primary contradiction, secondary contradiction. It gets theorized through the various states and parties that have associated themselves with these radical politics. And it's very problematic. It's very problematic because it's an abstract conception that doesn't actually follow how people's consciousness works. And people's consciousness is messy. It isn't orderly in these various stages. And I mean, we do have to set priorities and we do have to decide what we're doing collectively, but having a prefab idea of one size fits all in all of our various social movements tends to be very divisive and not unifying. And it doesn't allow you to think of, like if you go into an organizing meeting, there's sometimes a few people who have a sense of what's going to happen at the end of the meeting before anyone has even participated. There's a different way of having a meeting where you say, let's talk about why we came here, and let's try to come up with what we think is the next step to do. So these are tricky questions. Theoretically, we do have the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. David Roediger has done some work on that, about the wages of whiteness, about psychological wage, to know that working class consciousness is not a linear process. It is not a linear process. And our enemies, the powers that be, are very conscious of the capacity to divide and conquer. We should also be aware that sometimes on the left we imitate that. Another point is, I'll just say thank you for bringing up the name of our late dear friend Aziz Chowdhury. I think he would be very active in this conversation and have a lot to say. And a lot of his work, which was published, actually deals, I think, with the textured reality of sort of a kind of sense of anti-racism from below in his work. And then, Carlo, thank you for naming and addressing this big elephant in the room of working class conservatism. I mean, we actually have to deal with this. And I think we have to deal with it in a way that is not simply borrowing, I think, which was an unfortunate idea of George Lukács, this notion of false consciousness. If it's false consciousness, then there's sometimes an abstract real consciousness, and who gets to be the arbiter in the room who determines what the real consciousness is at any given moment? I mean, consciousness, it's complicated, and it changes over time, and it is messy. We have the brilliant contribution of Kimberly Crenshaw to say we can talk about this as an intersectional phenomenon. That's a big headline, for a lot of complicated things. But I do think we need to address this, and it is not something that we can explain simply by saying neoliberalism has caused poverty, poverty has caused conservative ideas are not really conservative ideas. And that seems to be a kind of default explanation. That concept doesn't work empirically if you're looking at the base of Donald Trump or the base of Brexit and so on, or the base of Doug Ford. It doesn't work empirically, but it also doesn't work theoretically. For us to just, it's sort of name-calling neoliberalism as opposed to actually doing the difficult work of unpacking the moment we're in. So, a series of non-answers for part of the conversation.
Well, on that note, I'd like to once again thank all of you for your excellent questions, and of course our speakers, Arun, Abigail, and of course Anne as well, for her excellent comments on John's lifelong work. I think this is a great start to the symposium, so thanks for getting us thinking and engaged for our series of discussions.